is Norm Volsky, your host, and this is the Digital Health Heavyweights podcast.
Thanks, Norm. It's an honor to be here, and it's been fun to work with you over the years.
Hello, and welcome to the Digital Health Heavyweights podcast with your host, Norm Volsky. And today we are thrilled to be joined by the president and CEO of Rock Health Advisory, Megan Zweig.
Hey, Norm. I'm just laughing. I totally forgot about the boxing gloves, but I love that.
Yep.
There you go.
It's all, again, in symbolism. We're going to be very friendly today, but
I didn't bring my gloves, so for the best.
we always have heavyweights in theory, not in reality. So excited to have you on the podcast. And for all of our viewers and listeners that are not as familiar with Megan and Rock Health Advisory, Rock Health is, an organization that helps enterprise companies act on opportunities, craft novel solutions, and succeed in an evolving landscape. Megan is CEO of Rock Health Advisory, and we'll talk to Megan on all the different things that Rock Health is doing. Previously, Megan served as COO of Rock Health and oversaw Rock Health's membership offering and research efforts. Prior to joining Rock Health, Megan worked at the advisory board company where she led Physician Executive Council, a best practice research membership supporting chief medical officers at over 1,300 hospitals and health systems nationwide. Megan also received an MBA from Berkeley and her executive MBA class in January of 2020. Megan graduated from Duke for her bachelor's in public policy and very passionate about funding, building, scaling tech-based solutions, and really excited to have Megan on to tell us all that Rock Health is doing. So, Megan, we ask this to everyone who joins. What inspired you to get into healthcare?
Yes. Okay. So you mentioned Duke, so we can go way back. Maybe it goes even further back to when I was young and I had an injury. I just slammed my finger in a door and I almost fainted. And I was always very interested in healthcare, and my mom is an athletic trainer. So my mom manages injuries all the time. She's the person with her little orange bag is running out onto the football field. So she is very tactile, very hands-on. She kind of thrives when there are injuries. When I slammed my finger in that door, I was like, this is not for me. I remember my mom was like, get on the couch because you're going to pass out soon because you're completely white. So I always knew that even though watching my mom care for people, I was, of course, always inspired by her and interested in healthcare, knew I was not going to go the clinical route very early. And so going into undergrad, I think, like many folks, I had no idea what I was going to major in. I thought it was going to be political science. That became a little bit too theoretical and philosophical for me, honestly. Started taking some public policy classes, which felt really grounded and practical, and I loved that. I loved my little cost-benefit analyses. And honestly, I took a class, I think it was called AIDS and Emerging Diseases, and it was a global health course. It was not a biological or clinical look at disease. It was more a look at, excuse me, I didn't know these words at the time, but kind of the social determinants of health, right? It is so multifactorial. It impacts all of us. And I was really struck by the systemic issues that I thought were alarming, but also complex and intellectually interesting. And I knew if we could tackle would have a massive impact. And so that kind of whet my appetite. I took a class on medical ethics. I read Atul Gawande's Complications book. And at that point I was hooked and decided to focus my public policy degree in health policy. And ultimately, after college, ended up getting a job with the advisory board company, a place with lots of people that I'm so grateful for, and really decided that I wanted to kind of focus on how can we make the U.S. healthcare system massively better.
I love that. That's great. I actually come from a medical family myself. My mom was a nurse, and she has been dean of nursing of a couple of nursing colleges. Her dad, my grandfather, was a nationally known radiologist. My sister's a doctor. One of my uncles is a doctor. My aunt was a doctor, so like it was definitely in the family, in the blood. I used to run cross country in high school,
Mm.
and I sustained a hernia. I think like either freshman or sophomore year. I think it was freshman year. Now that I think about it. And when I got my first surgery, I had a medical student doing rotations who did the IV and like
Yeah.
started spilling blood first time, and I passed out, and that's when I knew I wasn't going to go into medicine. So we have a similar story there, but we did find our way into healthcare, serendipitously. Walk us through your experience at the advisory board. I think a lot of people who have done amazing things in this space started and kind of cut their teeth in advisory board, and it's a great organization.
Yeah. I loved working there. I mean, it was such a joy to move to DC, start a role where there were a bunch of smart, energized young professionals in the same situation as me. And it really admittedly like taught me how to think. I mean, hopefully I was thinking a little bit before then, but it taught me how to really rigorously assess problems, look for root causes, as we would say, we would whiteboard with these like root cause trees to be like, okay, they say that sepsis mortality is going up, but why? Like, what is that issue set? And I think what it really instilled in me, and I should have said I was in the research department, and so my role was really building best practice research that was then delivered to hospital executives to solve what we called their up at night issues. That was our favorite question to ask. What's your up at night issue? Although I'm like, God, I hope not that many people are up at night with their issues. But it was just a turn of phrase and really getting at like, what are those persistent challenges that people want to crack and people want to learn from each other on? And it really struck me that there was this like collectiveness to it. It wasn't just, I want the best answer for my organization. Of course, that was true of our members, but it was also, how can I contribute my own learnings and my own successes and failures to this collective? Because, I mean, I'm using the sepsis example because that was one research project that I worked on, but, every hospital is thinking about, how do we improve our infection rates? How do we reduce our mortality? How do we follow the evidence-based care pathway in this regard? And so I just thought it was really cool that competitive dynamics didn't get in the way of how do we ultimately provide the best care to our patients. And there's probably a right answer, or at least a better answer out there. And so my job as the researcher was to talk to enough of these executives to make sure I deeply understood the problem we were trying to solve, and then find those best practices. And then, of course, deliver that research and those strategies and tactics in a way that was easy to understand, digestible, and actionable. And I think that training has just continued to serve me really well throughout my career.
Well, that was a huge undertaking, and there are probably thousands and thousands of people that pass away, from sepsis like every
Yes.
single year. So like
Yes.
you were working on something that, truly had the potential to save lives, and I'm sure did save lives, because of the
Yeah.
work you and your colleagues did.
Can I
But I
share
couldn't
one
imagine
story?
something more rewarding than like,
Yeah.
oh, because I did X, these other, clinicians did Y, and Z was, less people had a fatal event, which you can't really impact anything better
Yeah.
than that.
And I'll share one story. I mean,
Please.
I appreciate you saying that because I do think that, I'm in an advisory consultative research role. Like I'm not at the bedside. And so
Yeah.
there is some distance from impact, right? That I think folks in my field can feel. And there was one moment, it just made all of this worth it, where I had done a lot of work when it came to what we called reducing clinical variability. How do we create processes, protocols, cultures, incentives such that care teams are better supported and able to practice evidence-based medicine? And how do you create an iterative culture and process around that? Because of course, our understanding of evidence is changing all the time. And there were some health systems that were really phenomenal at that, Intermountain, Banner Health being some of those that we interviewed and profiled. And I kind of took this research to different health systems across the US who were intrigued by that type of model. And I went to, I won't say names, but I went to one health system in the Midwest and gave a presentation. And you're in and out, and I had a really nice time. The group was really engaged, great questions, but I present the research, answer questions and follow up, but then put it to bed to some degree. Like, that was my job. And years later, I was working at Rock Health, and I think it was a LinkedIn message or an email from the chief medical officer that I had been working with, and he was like, hey, I think he had retired at that point, wanted to catch up. I had no idea what he wanted to catch up about.
Yeah.
And this was probably in 2021 or 2022. And we caught up, and he was like, I actually really just wanted to thank you, because that research that you provided was so transformative for our organization in terms of how we built care protocols, how we rolled them out, how we integrated them into the care workflow, how we created culture around that and buy-in. And he said, we were more prepared for the pandemic than we would have been without that. He was like, I do think that we saved lives because we had to transform overnight with new ways of working and new protocols to manage COVID. And he was like, that infrastructure that we had built off of some of the ideas that you had brought allowed us to do that. And honestly, that's like the most profound impact phone call I've probably ever received in my life. I was so taken that he would take the time to do that. And it was just a reminder to me, you don't always see it, but what you are teaching, what you're telling people, it does matter.
Yeah, it's just so important that people in their day-to-day work life have purpose, and what an amazing purpose that was. It was just awesome to hear. Any other successes or learnings from your time at an advisory board that also were pretty crucial to your own self-satisfaction and your career growth, and what led you to this?
So many learnings. I think one that
I
really,
think the quality of talent at advisory board was second to none. Their bar and who they let into the organization and just the culture and the talent was unheard of. So, I think that is a special thing about being within it. Rising tide lifts all ships.
yes, I'm incredibly humbled by all of the people that I got to work with and what they're doing now. And it boggles my mind. I think, and this actually speaks to one of those people, I just started doing on-site. So I just started essentially was graduated to the level where the advisory board decided that, they would send me off to speak in front of executive teams or boards based on the research that I had been doing. And I was sent to a hospital. It was my first one. I just remember feeling that I wasn't the authority in the room. Mm-hmm. And I admittedly wasn't. I was surrounded by, and admittedly, it was a room full of older men. I was by far the youngest. I was the only woman in the room. I was reminded when I walked in, in my black suit, as we do at the advisory board, I was reminded that the chief medical officer that had kind of shepherded this whole thing said that I looked a lot like his daughter, and it just created a particular dynamic. And I just remember they did not gravitate towards the insights that I was sharing. There was a lot of pushback. There was a lot of skepticism. Well, what you're sharing might work at XYZ health system. It doesn't work for us, and here's why. And I felt so defeated coming out of that meeting, not just because of how it made me feel small, but because I was like, wow, that really didn't land. I don't think I was helpful, right? And I came back, and I'm not sure if she remembers this, but my boss at the time was a woman named Amanda Barra. Huge shout out to Amanda. She was an incredible boss, and I could be vulnerable with her and tell her this story and how it made me feel and how I wanted to get better. And I felt like I had disappointed the advisory board. I just remember her saying, try not to get your ego wrapped up in this. This isn't about you, right? What they think of you, how you come off, it's actually not about you or the fact that regardless of what happens in that room, you are still you have your full value, of course, right? Detach a little bit was the message. And it was also, the next really important thing she said was and you're a vehicle for learning. It's not about Megan, it's about you teaching something. And guess what? You studied this stuff for more than 6 months. You've talked to hundreds of executives about the topic. These people are going to know so much more than you and have so much more experience in other areas. But on this topic, you know a lot. You have something to share. You have something to teach. So be that vehicle for teaching And that was so helpful for me because I could let go of, I don't know, some aura that I wanted to have in the room and more just be like, I am here because I have valuable knowledge. I'm going to do my very best to impart that to you. And she gave me permission to say when I didn't know something, right? Like I felt like I was tongue-tied trying to, come up with something that I could say that would sound intelligent. And instead, I probably just should have said, that's such a great question. What do you think? Because I didn't look into that, or that's a really tough question. I don't know the answer there. I didn't find one. Like, let's talk about it. And I just think all of that advice has served me so well. And it's funny because later as you mentioned, like I went to Berkeley Haas, I got an executive MBA, and there it's all about like, how do you bring yourself into your leadership? So it's kind of like, okay, how do I recenter Megan a little bit in my leadership? But I think in my younger career, I was just like, you know what, focus on the task at hand, focus on the job you're trying to do and the impact you're trying to have, and be less focused on like, how did that make me feel? Or like, it's not about them not liking me necessarily. I mean, maybe they didn't, I don't know. But like, it's not about that. It's about them trying to interrogate the data that I'm bringing them and the research that I'm bringing them. And again, that's not about me. That's about engaging with a conversation with people who are just curious and who are going to have their own experiences that they're bringing to the table. And I think that was such an important lesson for me.
I can say this, a lot of people hang on to imposter syndrome way more than just the first time they present to a large audience.
Oh, yes.
Some people keep it their whole career. I'm really glad to hear you ditched it quickly and promptly. So again, motivation to other folks who watch this that feel the same feeling that Megan felt, but maybe for weeks, months, years, decades. Like,
yeah,
it's not about you. If something doesn't go the way you want it to, it's not because of how they feel about you. It's just they're going to look out for themselves. They're going to look out for like their fiduciaries, and they're just trying to make the best decisions for their areas of focus. And you can't take these things personally.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong.
Know as much as you can about the subject matter.
Totally.
And the rest will take care of itself.
Totally. And like, don't get me wrong, it was a journey. It wasn't like an overnight switch. I remember like going into conference rooms and practicing interviews, practicing my presentations until I felt natural enough to actually give it a little more off the cuff. And I still do that to some degree. So
totally.
Yeah.
Great advice. Really, really good advice. Mentioned earlier, you were supporting chief medical officers at over 1,300 hospitals and health systems nationwide. How do you do all that? That's a large scale.
Yeah.
Walk us just through, working with so many different CMOs that all had different agendas.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, just mechanically how it worked was we had a research membership for these chief medical officers. They would opt in. And that meant that they would get access to the resources, the data, the conferences that we were pulling together. And so the examples I've given so far were more one-off of me going on site to a single organization, but we would have these national meetings where, it could be dozens and dozens and dozens of chief medical officers are in the room, engaging with content, engaging with each other. And that's where I think the power really comes in of seeing peers engage with the content. And it's even more powerful when you're in the room and you may have an organization in the room that you're profiling, is what we would call it, right? So if we had a case study about a particular organization, we might get questions on like, well, that wouldn't work at our organization because, or how did they convince their care teams that this was the right path for the organization? And it's one thing for a researcher to say it. It's another thing for it to come from the person who like led that program and saw that success. So those were definitely my favorite moments of unlocking like, oh, wow, like this is how that innovation happened. And I think one of the things that I learned is like the best kind of leadership is not about explicit authority. And I saw that so much with the CMO cohort because oftentimes the chief medical officers don't have a direct reporting line or like a traditional employee arrangement with their physicians. They are leading through culture, they are leading through influence, they are leading through taking a data-driven, evidence-based approach to like, what should our care model be? What should the care pathways be? How do we improve quality? And oftentimes like that can't simply be mandated or turned on. I mean, we all know working in healthcare for so long, it takes so much change management. And so I really liked that it wasn't just about thinking like, okay, going back to sepsis, like we know that there are evidence-based protocols for treating sepsis, but what gets in the way of that? What are the cultural pieces, the process pieces, the like, you know, the lab isn't close enough to the patient room, so you're getting results are too late. I'm like making this up, but like all the different intricate workflow pieces and people pieces that play into, did that patient ultimately get the care that they needed in time? And I think working with chief medical officers really instilled that in me. It's not about authority and mandates. It's about like, how do you get a bunch of incredibly well-trained, smart people, passionate people behind a particular vision by proving to them like this is the way that we need to go to get the outcomes that we all want.
Yeah, like creating a culture of constant learning and
Yes.
constant self-improvement and having that like ideal goal at the end is a hard one to accomplish, and I think a lot of your insights made it easier on those leaders to be able to get people bought in to some really really cool ideas and missions. So walk us through what inspired you to join Rock Health. You went from
Yes.
one very well
Yes.
respected company to another. Walk us through that transition.
Yeah, it was a big jump for me. It felt really different. Some of it was personal. I had been living in DC for a while. I grew up in Los Angeles, and so I wanted to come back to California. I was fortunate to make the case at the advisory board to move to their satellite San Francisco office. So I moved to SF, worked for the advisory board for a few years, but I was flying back and forth to DC a lot.
Yeah.
And I felt like a remote worker because most of my team was still in DC. And I just knew for myself, like I really wanted to build my life in SF. I wanted to really have roots here. And for me, that meant joining a team that was based in the Bay and really immersing myself in what I was just getting a taste of, this like innovation ecosystem that at the time was just going really gangbusters. And so I wish I could say it was like a really intentional, methodical job hunt. I think I went to like a Rock Health panel. I remember showing up to the classic JPM Rock Health happy hour. It was raining. They were giving out umbrellas. I didn't know anybody there. And I had seen that they were hiring a director of research. And so I knew that they were on the hunt for somebody. I was like, I'm going to go to this happy hour. I'm going to talk to them, make my case, basically. And I got there, and it was just swarms of people. It was so packed, and everybody already knew each other, and there was this energy. It was a little intimidating, admittedly, because I was like, oh my God, this is like a new space in healthcare that I don't know. I'm not a part of. I had no idea who worked for Rock Health there. So like there was no way I was like networking my way to a job there. But I was like, oh, this feels dynamic. It feels energizing. And there's like, this is a whole space that I know nothing about. And that's really exciting to me. So long story short, I slowly kind of made my way to figuring out who was on the team and getting some conversations with them. And I was really fortunate to be hired by Bill Evans. And I would say, so Rock Health was founded back in 2010.
Yeah.
By Hallie Tecco and Nate Gross. And
15 years. That's
I know.
shocking.
I know. And I can't speak for them, but what I know of the story and the lore, they were really interested in helping to make this market. Like it was not nearly like, obvious statement, but not nearly the market that it is today. And so I think part of why they were hiring a director of research was because from day one, part of what they had to do was, in order to make a market, was to document that market and research that market and build a narrative for why entrepreneurs might be excited to move into the healthcare space, or why large healthcare companies should even pay attention to some of the emerging innovations and technologies and startups that were coming out. And so there was always this kind of foundation of thought leadership, of data-driven thought leadership of, let's be tracking funding, let's report out on that, let's report out on the trends, let's kind of showcase what we believe the true opportunity is. Let's also showcase like the immense challenges. But let's talk about the opportunity too. And so I was really brought on to help steward what they had begun, in terms of how do we continue to be an incredibly data-driven, trusted brand that is showcasing to the market what is possible and what is necessary when it comes to adopting emerging technologies into the business of healthcare and into care delivery. And so I joined because I was excited by that. I mean, there's obviously like a clear clear path from the research skill set that I built at the advisory board to the skill set I was going to be using at Rock Health, but I was excited to apply it in a completely new context and a completely new part of healthcare. I really, to be frank, didn't know that much about innovation or AI or digital health before that. Bill definitely threw me into the deep end on that one, in terms of like, okay, you're going to be writing about AI in healthcare now. But I was excited for that steep learning curve, and it was just the right pivot for me. Plus, going from the advisory board is a very large organization. It was actually acquired by Optum a few months, I think, after I had joined Rock Health. And so Rock Health, I think at the time, there's probably 7 or 8 of us, in a small office in Mission Bay. So that was like an exciting experience that I wanted to have.
I find it a little bit ironic that you moved to the Bay and you wanted to have more work with people side by side and in office, and then you join the company and it immediately is COVID. Walk us through that transition of working in a new company, probably having to work from home, and everyone's kind of remote. Walk me through that experience and how that was a challenge, but also potentially an opportunity as well.
Yeah. So I was fortunate because I joined Rock Health in 2017. So I had a few good years. So it wasn't an immediate switch. No, it's all good.
2020 was coming back from the MBA program.
Yes, exactly. So we had a few good years that, I mean, I'm still incredibly close with everyone that was on that team. The portfolio companies that we shared our office space with, it was just a really, really special time, and I'm really grateful that I had that. Not to mention that when I joined,
portfolio companies did you have that were kind of cohabitating that space?
I think at most it was 4. I think it usually oscillated between 2 and 4. I mean, our space wasn't enormous, but we did have a pretty good space in Mission Bay. No.
Okay.
No. It was kind of these are the folks that wanted a handful of desks in San Francisco, loved our space. We'd have lunch together on Mondays. It was really fun because I think that I credit them and that setup to me acclimating to the space so much more quickly.
That's great.
2020 did hit. I had just wrapped up my executive MBA, also just timing, incredibly grateful that I literally walked and graduated in January 2020. So I kind of had the full in-person experience. And so 2020 was an interesting time for Rock Health too, because we really solidified how we're structured today. So our kind of overall shared vision at Rock Health is how do we transform health for all humanity and bring greater humanity to healthcare. And today, we've really solidified that into 3 different pathways. So one is we do have a venture fund, we continue to have a venture fund. Bill Evans runs Rock Health Capital. We invest in early stage digital health companies. We have Rock Health Advisory, which of course is what I lead. And that really came about because early on we recognized that you could pour a ton of capital, not just us, but the whole ecosystem into these companies, but they're not going to take scale, have the impact, integrate with the existing healthcare system unless they work with the big players, unless they're embraced by pharma and health plans and health systems and tech companies and retail companies and employers. And so we decided all of the insights that we're building around this innovation ecosystem are incredibly valuable to those big companies. So let's build an advisory practice to work with those innovation and strategy and corp dev leaders at those organizations. So that was kind of the impetus for Rock Health Advisory. And then the third piece is rockhealth.org. So my colleague Katie Drosser is the CEO of rockhealth.org, our nonprofit. They're really incredibly focused on that shared vision of how do we transform health for all humanity, right? There's a lens in there of how do we make sure that this isn't just reaching commercially insured populations. How do we make sure that we're actually leveraging emerging technology to close equity gaps? And so the three of us work incredibly closely together in service of that shared vision, but through our different approaches. And so that kind of really solidified in 2020. And it was when we had brought on Tom Castles to lead Rock Health Advisory. I was his COO at the time. And it felt, in some ways, it was interesting because it felt like we were starting to really ramp up this team at a time that we could pull talent from anywhere in the US.
Yeah.
And I'm so grateful for that because now we have this incredibly talented team. We are recruiting from across the US. We have a lot of folks in different hubs, still in San Francisco and LA and DC and Boston and New York and Chicago. And I think that there was a lot of discussion of like, how do we preserve the community aspect of Rock Health and this strong sense of team while, we may not have met in person when we're onboarding folks. And so I think that still like the in-person touch points are really, really important for our culture, whether that's at our big events, CEO Summit, Rock Health Summit, our member forums, or whether that's when we're getting together on our own. But we've also had to find ways to kind of get together and learn from each other day to day too, when we're not seeing each other in person. And we do that through things like open mics where we're sharing what we're learning. We're getting guest speakers in. We do that, through, fun ways that we use our Slack channel, just the kind of the little tactics that I think companies have realized make a big difference in feeling connected to each other.
So you started as like head of research, move into COO of Rock Health Advisory, and now, you've gotten all the way to top CEO of Rock Health Advisory. Walk people through who are ambitious in their career, maybe earlier stage, maybe, where you were 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah.
What advice would you give someone that wants to accomplish a lot and, eventually rise to, a leadership position, within a company?
Yeah. I will share my experience, and hopefully folks can take what's relevant for them and throw out the rest. For me, my big unlock was that I had growing up at the advisory board, up a promotion ladder where I was always managing people and work that I had done previously.
Yeah.
And that kind of turned me into a micromanager. Maybe I had that bent to begin with. But if you're managing stuff that you had done in the weeds yourself, you're going to kind of like have the expectation of like, well, this is how we do it, right? And I didn't have that self-awareness, of course, at the time. Like I got that later because the unlock for me was I did go to business school. I'm not suggesting everybody needs to go to business school, but this is kind of where that insight was ingrained. And I at the time was at Rock Health, and I was still kind of managing stuff and things that I had done before, market research, data management, insight generation, etc. And I was really one thing. I mean, that's a lot of things, but I feel like I had this relatively scoped skill set. And the timing of me going to Berkeley was also the timing of, I was really fortunate to Bill, who I think saw potential in me and said, hey, I don't just want you to manage research. Why don't you manage marketing as well? And I was like, what? I've never done marketing. We have somebody doing marketing. Like what? Like, what is this? What is this like general management responsibilities where I'm not going to know the ins and outs of that person's job who is now on my team, and I never did it myself.
Yeah.
And so being in business school was helpful because you had a lot of people who were managing multiple functions and big teams who hadn't necessarily, as I say, like grown up in that function. And so it was, how do you actually build leadership skills, people skills, management skills so that you could still offer direction and coaching and feedback without the micromanagement of it, right? Like that's what broke me out of it, was like, well, I can't do that anymore. I have to really entrust that this person that we've hired with this skill set kind of knows what to do, and I need to guide them on what we're trying to accomplish together, but how they get that done day to day, is really going to be up to them.
Yeah.
And if we're not hitting our goals, if they're feeling stuck, like I'm going to come in and hopefully help unstick them if I can. But that was so important because I was able to get off the track of like, I felt a little bit like a one-trick pony. And I should say, you have to be that in a very big organization. Like if I was still at the advisory board, like that would have been the way to rise, was becoming increasingly like expert and specialized and managing a singular function. But for me, at the small organization, less than 10-person organization of Rock Health, my growth was not going to be just becoming more deep in research. It was going to be that I became more of a broad leader and almost like a general manager. And I really liked that. I found that I really liked that. And so that, I think, is the same thing that managed to get me to the COO role and ultimately the now CEO role, was recognizing that my job is not to be the best at all of the things that we are doing. In fact, I can confidently say I'm definitely not that on the team. But it is to set a tone and set a vision and make sure that the team feels supported so that they can do their best job. And hopefully that means that I have stepped off the gas when I can on some of the micromanagey tendencies. And yeah, kind of rising the organization, like, help me. You gotta let go of that. You gotta let go of that and trust people.
When you become a manager and leader of like an entire like division or the entire organization, like your main job is to attract great talent and keep them there and keep them happy and keep them motivated and keep them excited about like the mission and like the overall goals of the organization. You can't do people's jobs for them. You got to hire them and let them do their own thing. And it sounds like you've harnessed that through these last 7 or so years, which is really, really great to hear.
Well, and you know that so intimately because you see why people leave companies and why people join companies.
People leave managers way more often than they leave companies.
Yeah.
So it's great, to just watch your journey and like hopefully that can help people speed up, their growth trajectory. That's a big theme of this podcast. Like, let's talk about all our mistakes so other people don't make them. So, that's really, really great to hear. How do you work with your clients and like, what does success look like in the advisory function?
Yes. I'll give like an intellectual answer and then I'll give a little bit more of like an emotional answer. So what success looks like for me is, so again, we tend to work with strategy leaders, innovation leaders, leaders launching new products, whether that's at life sciences companies, med device companies, health systems, health plans. We do work with some tech and retail companies, really those organizations that are trying to understand what's going on in the external market to inform my own innovation bets and innovation strategies. And so I think success looks like our clients taking measured risks that they might not otherwise and doing that armed with data and feedback and intelligence so that they feel really confident in those bets that they are making, whether that's integrating a new digital health vendor, whether that's launching a new digital product, whether that's just figuring out how to educate their employee base on emerging analytics or AI features. So I want them to feel like we have helped equip them with the data, the knowledge, the connections, so that they can feel like they are making the right bets for their organizations. I think my more emotional answer to this question is it's really well illustrated by something that happened in September at our member forum. So we will bring together our clients for a day of learning. And, we ask them at the end of the day to kind of reflect on, what they learned, what they heard, like, what are they taking away from the day? Yeah. And I was really struck by how many of our members said, like, this is a really special room. You curate a really special group. I feel incredibly energized by this day. Like, we've spent the day talking about challenges and why innovation is hard and what we're trying to accomplish but haven't yet. But I'm still taking from that there is so much to celebrate in the small wins. There are people to lean on, and there are insights that we are unlocking together that's going to help all of us make better decisions. And so I'm really proud that I think when we do our work well, like, we are actually helping to energize and encourage the people, not just inform the organizations, but energize and encourage the people that we are working with, because we all got into this business for a particular reason, to have impact. The work is not easy. There have been a lot of ups and downs in the market lately. And so like perseverance is incredibly important, and belief in what you're doing. And so I actually think it's important for us to help instill that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So Rock Health recently shared their 2024 year-end market overview. For anyone who hasn't like read the entire thing, any key insights that you really like felt were important, and any trends, coming out of digital health that you see, over the next handful of years?
Yeah. So what you're referring to, we do a quarterly research piece on what we're seeing in terms of market trends. A lot of those trends are informed by our analysis of venture funding and kind of where investors are placing their bets in the startup ecosystem. We also look at the exit market, as well as the public markets, and also interview our clients to understand, like, okay, what are you seeing? We also, interestingly, do this data-driven analysis at the end of the year to make predictions. Mm-hmm. Predictions are often finger in the wind, and those are fun, and we can talk about them, but we wanted to like build more of a methodology to figure out what are the trends that are really like rising in terms of their potential and in terms of their adoption. Being data-driven, we look at, okay, like, is there venture funding flowing into that space? What's the degree of enterprise startup partnerships that are happening, which is like tends to be a sign of maturity that things are actually getting implemented. And then what is the degree of like academic research that's being done around a topic that actually might signal that something is a bit more nascent, that it's kind of still percolating in academia but hasn't really reached commercialization and implementation yet. So across those vectors, we looked at a number of different topics. I mean, you might have guessed like obesity care, digital weight care really is kind of jumping the curve in terms of its prevalence. I think that's been an exciting space. Also coupled with food as medicine, which is definitely moving up that curve just to kind of complement the surge in GLP demand and usage that we've seen. There's this interesting confluence of how are digital solutions actually pairing with pharmaceutical intervention for nutrition, for fitness, for just overall chronic care management. And then also, how is just the way that we access care really changing access to drugs and those solutions? I mean, you have like Lilly Direct, Pfizer for All, these kind of increasingly direct-to-consumer ways that these organizations are trying to connect consumer needs to their offerings. So that was an interesting thing to watch. Also, we've kind of been seeing like this emergence of next-generation wearables, so kind of 2.0 after the smartwatches, rings, patches, materials. So that's been really interesting. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of validation that needs to happen around that so that they can be used in a clinical trial care context. We were kind of surprised. We have some early results that we haven't published yet from a survey that we did with primary care physicians. I think it was over half. We can check myself on the data when it gets published, but I think it was over half of those primary care physicians say that they are on a weekly basis integrating remote monitoring wearable device data into their conversations with patients. And it is informing the care plan. We were kind of surprised by the adoption and use of that, but I have to believe that some of that is coming from consumer expectations and just the increased prevalence of these wearables. So that was kind of a trend that we saw emerging. Also, climate health. We did publish in December that we're hearing from more pharma companies, health systems. They're really trying to understand the health impact of things like extreme weather, heat. I have to mention fires.
Not extreme cold. They can study Cleveland right now.
Yes, exactly. So that's kind of still very nascent in terms of how the ecosystem is tackling that, but seeing some emerging interest and solutions. So those are kind of topically some of the areas that we're looking at. And then I'd say broadly, I mean, definitely saw a return to funding levels that look a lot more like pre-pandemic levels, right? Like after that surge
There's a lot more optimism in the market.
Yes. And I think that optimism is in part driven by more realistic expectations, like more realistic expectations for those companies, more realistic valuations, growth trajectories that feel like these teams can really tackle and accomplish. And I think we have seen like a bit of we kind of use this theme of David and Goliath in our piece to talk about, like, I already mentioned like some of the big moves of these big pharma companies. We could talk about Amazon. We could talk about all of the AI, like foundational models that are being built and the race there. So there are these very, very big players that are jockeying for market positioning in the healthcare space. And interestingly, like we actually saw that most of the venture funding, most of the deals are going to early stage deals. So there's still a lot of bets being made on these niche, smaller, early stage companies that are still figuring out kind of their product market fit and how they're going to grow and scale. But I think that that's promising, because when we saw those peak levels of funding, there were so many mega deals, these deals over $100 million, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but you just had a lot of companies that couldn't keep on that growth clip. And so it's cool to see that there's been this shift towards strengthening funding going to the seed Series A companies for this next wave of innovation.
Yep, I'm seeing it myself. So really excited for the future. I ask everyone who joins the podcast, like, how do you practice what you preach? You work in healthcare, but you also like are a healthcare consumer. So like in a very stressful job, how do you exercise, and like what are your favorite ways to exercise? I know you like to hike. And how do you keep, your stress levels low in a stressful job?
Yeah, it's like, I feel like I shouldn't even have put on our website that I like hiking, because saying you like hiking in San Francisco, people assume that you're like going on major backpacking trips to Yosemite every weekend, which is like not quite what I do, but I love a good hike. I do go to Yosemite with my family every year. I've been getting more into like yoga plus strength training, like together. I go to Core Power. It's hot and sweaty, but I don't know. I feel like I've been craving something a little bit more active. I'm like long time yogi Pilates person. Like that's usually my jam, but I feel like I've been trying to get my heart rate up a little bit more and do a little bit more with still very small weights, but with some weights in my life. I'm also vegan, so that was like, wasn't even actually
that way, like 95% of the time. I eat a little bit of fish and seafood, but yeah, I've made that transition personally as well.
Yeah, and that wasn't really a health decision initially. I was like 9 and I just didn't like meat, and I was lactose intolerant, and I was like, hey parents,
Yeah,
like,
lactose intolerant.
yeah,
Like,
yeah,
forced on you, and then the other stuff is kind of
yeah,
choice.
yeah. And it kind of evolved into more of a health choice, ethics choice, but yeah, that's like, try to eat well, although, that sometimes happens, and sometimes I'm just eating French fries, so,
Yeah, absolutely. And then any favorite recipes? Maybe it's a main course, side dish, condiment.
Let's see. This is so random. I really like making lasagna, like, which sounds funny for a vegan, but I make like
Can
a
you
tofu.
send me your
Oh,
lasagna
for sure.
recipe, and we'll maybe make it on the Digital Health, Healthy Headhunters video series,
Nice.
and we'll see if my team likes a vegan lasagna.
Yeah, I have like, it's on like a yellow legal pad because my sister like wrote it out because she kind of like iterated on different recipes. So
We're gonna
yeah,
test
shout out
it
to
out on
Sarah.
my carnivore team and see if we
Yeah,
can
see if they
get
can
the
tell. A lot of
vegan
people
eating.
can't really tell. Because you make the tofu ricotta, like you put some sauce, you put some veggies, you maybe put some like Impossible crumbles or something, and it's
Nice.
really good. Yeah.
I'm gonna try it. Well, thank you so
Excellent.
much for
Thank
joining
you,
us on the
Norm.
Digital Health Heavyweights podcast. Really excited to see what you and Rock Health accomplish and help others accomplish over the next bunch of years. And thank you so much for joining.
I really appreciate it, Norm. This was really fun. Thanks for having
Thank you.
me.
Take care.
Bye.
Thank you for joining. Please like, comment, and subscribe below if you enjoyed it.